Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Joe Biden went on television this afternoon, and talked to the country about Afghanistan. He said, among other things, that we had no choice but to leave. And on that question, he is right. The United States should have left Afghanistan 19 years ago when it became obvious that Osama bin Laden wasn't there and had fled to Pakistan. There was no reason to stay in the country. And the longer we remained, the worse it was always going to be. The question is, and the relevant question today, is how exactly do you get out? Just because something is necessary doesn't mean you get to ignore the details of it. If you learned you needed an emergency appendectomy, would it matter to you who performed the operation, a surgeon with a scalpel or a drunk guy with a pocket knife? Yes, it would matter to you. But it didn't matter to Joe Biden, apparently. He barely mentioned the withdrawal today. Biden did the necessary thing in the ugliest possible way. If you've been watching television during the day, you've probably seen this footage. It's terrified men in sandals clinging to the side of a C-17 as it attempts to leave Afghanistan. And this is the iconic photo of the moment. It's the final humiliating scene of the American occupation of Afghanistan. That means that after 20 years and trillions of dollars, our leaders couldn't manage to pull off an orderly retreat. They couldn't even secure a single runway. And that's the main lesson of the fall of Kabul. We are led by buffoons. They have no idea what they're doing. We know that now. They're imposters. Everything they touch turns to chaos, not just there, but here. These are the people who run the Amtrak station in Midtown Manhattan, the one that's filled with drug addicts. They're the people in charge of the power grid in the state of California. They have no useful skills. And yet somehow these same people assured us they were going to turn Stone Age Afghanistan into modern Belgium. Remembering it now is bitter and hilarious. At this point, our leaders are so discredited, they're running out of ways to criticize the Taliban. Is the Biden administration really going to attack the new government of Afghanistan for forcing women to cover their faces? Are American diplomats actually going to lecture Taliban leaders about toppling statues? Probably not going to happen. That's how much credibility our leaders have lost, how much moral authority they have squandered in the past 20 years. But most of what they've lost is their self-awareness. They have none. Until just this weekend, for example, they had no idea how badly they were failing in Afghanistan. Here's John Kirby of the Pentagon explaining that, calm down, America, everything in Kabul is under control. Keep in mind, we have not edited this tape, and it's not from last year. This is 3 days ago.
Kabul is not, right now, in an imminent threat environment.
Oh, good job, John Kirby. Think he'll keep his job? Of course he'll keep his job. A man who's willing to defend pregnant fighter pilots can work in Washington forever. And so can Mark Milley at the Joint Chiefs and the rest of the woke clowns at the Pentagon. Generals who are much more worried about white rage in West Virginia than they are about our enemies abroad. When was the last time these guys won a war? Seriously, they hate it when you ask that question. Nothing bothers them more. But what's the answer? When was that? And while we're at it, how about the intel agencies? Their job is very specific. Give policymakers some rough sense of what's going to happen in the world, especially on the big questions, so they can make wise decisions. How's the intel world doing on that? Let's see. The collapse of the Soviet Union, 9/11, the fall of Kabul, not small things, major history-changing events. They missed all of those completely. They had no idea. So why are they still there? Well, because someone's got to read your text messages, got to make sure you're not making fun of trans people or anything like that. And then there's the Biden administration overseeing all of it, the group led by the senile credit card shill from Delaware and staffed by power-hungry nonentities who believe they're God. Hubris? That doesn't describe the vibe at the current White House. It's much more grandiose than that, and there's far less justification for it. Here's our sitting national security advisor, for example. He is 44 years old. As far as we can tell, he has never had an actual job. Outside of school, he has no accomplishments whatsoever. Watch this highly respected Rhodes Scholar explain that, in fact, everything you're seeing on TV from Afghanistan is a victory.
How do you explain getting this so wrong?
Well, first, Savannah, to be fair, the helicopter has been the mode of transport from our embassy to the airport for the last 20 years.
But you know the larger point.
It's
not the helicopter.
That is how we move
it's not
people
the mechanism.
Back and forth, so
no, it's the last-minute scramble. You know that. It's the last-minute scramble when the assurances from the president himself were this was not what we were going to see.
The reason that there are U.S. forces at the airport effectuating a successful drawdown of our embassy, securing the airport to be able to get other people out, is because because the president pre-positioned those forces, thousands of them, in the Gulf so they could be moved in rapidly in the event that there was a rapid collapse.
Oh, so they're effectuating a successful drawdown of our embassy. So that's what we call it when you burn your files and flee in a helicopter from approaching gunfire. You're just effectuating another successful drawdown. Woohoo! We could go on. We could torture you with the failures and the details. We haven't even mentioned our, quote, Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, a man so mediocre you gasp when you hear him speak. Can you really be that dumb and run the Department of State? Yeah, you can. And the last several decades of American foreign policy prove that you can. Afghanistan is not the first country our leaders have left worse than they found it. The list of those countries is long, and sadly, it's growing. Part of the reason is that for decades, left-wing academics in the U.S. have used the developing world as a laboratory to test their theories about how societies ought to be ordered but aren't. Over time, they've constructed a parallel government of NGOs that work alongside our Pentagon and our State Department, as well as with the United Nations, to impose radical social engineering projects on the world's poorest people who have no say in the matter. Over the past 20 years, for example, Congress has allocated close to $1 billion to export academic feminism to Afghanistan. Where'd that money go? Well, it went to programs like a 2-year master's degree in gender and women's studies offered at Kabul University, something Afghans apparently never knew they needed. Another U.S. government effort, meanwhile, funded, quote, activities that educate and engage Afghan men and boys to challenge gender stereotypes. Right, they weren't doing that enough. And of course, always and everywhere, our leaders enforced the most American of all cultural exports, affirmative action. American-funded gender advisors demanded that women compromise at least 10% of the Afghan National Army and a still larger proportion of that country's political leadership. Thanks to American-imposed gender quotas, dozens of women ultimately were installed as representatives in Afghan's parliament. How'd that work? Well, the whole thing was a sham, as always. In fact, many of these new female legislators had never been to the provinces they claimed to represent. Almost nobody in Afghanistan liked any of this, by the way, and why would they? As one USAID official conceded in a classified report, quote, focusing on gender made things more unstable because it caused revolts. It caused revolts. But officials kept doing it. They kept pushing radical gender politics anyway because they could, because they were in charge of these Stone Age people they were going to educate. This is the face of the late American empire, gender studies seminars at gunpoint. This is not like other empires. Unlike other empires, ours does not operate for our benefit. America toppled Saddam but took no oil. Remember that? Instead, the entire point of our imperial project is to give meaning to the empty lives of the neoliberal bureaucrats who administer it and then enrich the contractors who work for them, who are enriched, you'll be happy to know. What role do the rest of us play in this? None. We just pay for it. Yesterday, to underscore that point, the Biden administration told us that American citizens would not be given priority in the evacuation from Kabul. So our government's official position is that American lives are not more valuable than the lives of foreigners. But you already knew that because you've seen our southern border. The people who made the Afghan occupation possible would like to see a lot more of our southern border, much more unrestrained immigration to the U.S. Bring in the refugees, they're screaming tonight. That's the only lesson they're taking from this debacle. Quote, America must not stand idly by, Mitt Romney tweeted today. The president must urgently rush to defend, rescue, and give and expand asylum. There is no time to spare. There's lots of time to spare as Americans die of fentanyl ODs and millions of foreign nationals whose identities we can't confirm move here. But when it comes to bringing Afghans to our country, there's no time to spare. And Liz Cheney firmly agrees with that. So does her friend Bill Kristol and Nancy Pelosi and Victoria Nuland at the State Department and so many more just like them. These are the architects of the disaster we are watching unfold on television. They should be groveling for our forgiveness, but they're not. Why? Because contrition requires decency. There's no chance. So we're getting it. And if history is any guide, and it's always a guide, we will see many refugees from Afghanistan resettle in our country in coming months, probably in your neighborhood. And over the next decade, that number may swell to the millions. So first we invade, and then we're invaded. It is always the same. We'll be spending a lot more time on that subject in coming weeks because it matters. But first, since Kabul has just fallen, it might be worth asking the most obvious question of all. Why did the Taliban win? How did the 6th century triumph over the 21st century? There are indications that the single most notorious and reviled government in the world, primitive people famous for their brutality, rigidity, and humorlessness, are more popular in parts of Afghanistan than they were when we expelled the mullahs from Kandahar 20 years ago. They don't seem to be less popular. So how did that happen? What's the answer? We ought to pause to think about that. Let's not just blow past it like it was an act of God. It's not. What is the answer? Well, countries are very complicated, all of them, so there are likely many answers. But one of those answers may be that the population of Afghanistan has firmly rejected what our leaders were selling it over 20 years. It turns out that the people of Afghanistan don't actually want gender studies symposia. They didn't actually buy the idea that men can become pregnant. They thought that was ridiculous. They don't hate their own masculinity. They don't think it's toxic. They like the patriarchy. Some of their women like it too. So now they're getting it all back. So maybe it's possible that we failed in Afghanistan because the entire neoliberal program is grotesque. It's a joke. It's contrary to human nature. It answers none of our deepest human desires. It is merely a performance staged for the performer. It's not even supposed to improve your life. It's ridiculous. And ideas that ridiculous can only be imposed by force, only with armed men at gunpoint. The moment these ideas are not mandatory, the second the troops withdraw, in fact, people tend to revert to the lives that they prefer to live. That may be the real lesson of Afghanistan. Let's hope our leaders notice it. Doug MacGregor is a retired Army colonel and former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. He joins us tonight because he is the one man who can answer the question, who should have known better? Doug, thanks so much for coming on tonight. You have called for withdrawal from Afghanistan for a long time. You gave the previous administration a detailed plan for how to do that without the results that we're seeing today. What did our government just do that we should not have done?
Well, I think there are three things that we have to take into consideration. First, of course, is that there was never an exit strategy, no glide path out of Afghanistan. When I was in the Pentagon, the only thing I could find out was there was an intention to stay indefinitely for some of the reasons that you outlined in your opening remarks. Lots of people were benefiting, not the American people and certainly not our soldiers and Marines, but there was no glide path out of the place. Secondly, we have these toxic senior military leaders, toxic because they simply don't tell the truth. And for 20 years, they have been lying, frankly, to the American people, to soldiers and Marines who were doing the fighting, telling them that things were getting better, that we were making progress, when the truth was we weren't. And the soldiers and Marines can't be blamed for that. They fought very well, let there be no mistake about it. But the generals have done a terrible job. And that's obvious from what you're seeing on the ground right now, the chaos, no planning, no preparation, awful. I can't think of anything worse. And then finally, we went in, we said we were going to fight terrorism. As you pointed out, that was over quite quickly. There was no reason to make war on the Taliban, had no role in 9/11. We were there for al-Qaeda only. Al-Qaeda escaped through the incompetence of Tommy Franks and others. But effectively, we had pushed them out of Afghanistan, and we should have left. We didn't do that. And so what have we got now? We don't have democracy. We haven't defeated terrorism per se. We've probably created some new ones. We have the largest narco state in the world that is now falling into the hands of new criminals and new terrorists.
All of that is depressing to hear and I think verifiably true. But I want to go to the very first point that you made, that after 20 years, there was no specific plan to leave. There was no, as you put it, glide path. How can that be?
Well, when we first went into Iraq, there was an argument between Rumsfeld and some others in his office. And finally, Paul Wolfowitz interjected and said, look, we just want to get the army into Iraq. I think there were a lot of people that decided they just wanted to get the military into these places and that somehow or another we would muddle through, that things would improve. You know, it can be said that a generation ends when its illusions are exhausted. I think it was Arthur Miller that said that. What you're seeing now on the television, this mass chaos, this dissolution, is really the end of the illusions that began long ago in the aftermath of Desert Storm with Madeleine Albright and her successors. Why aren't we using the Army, she said to General Colin Powell. You keep talking about how good it is, let's use it. He obviously was not excited about seeing it employed for reasons other than fighting. Well, we've employed it and the Marine Corps all over the Middle East. And what have we created? Chaos. What have we established that's in the interest of the American people? Nothing.
They're reckless children. And you've confirmed it again. Colonel Douglas MacGregor, I appreciate your coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, not long ago, in June, the Secretary of State, the aforementioned Tony Blinken, assured America that Afghanistan would definitely not fall in just a matter of days. So, not long ago, in June, the Secretary of State, the aforementioned Tony Blinken, assured America that Afghanistan would definitely not fall in just a matter of days.
I don't think it's going to be something that happens from a Friday to a Monday. So I wouldn't necessarily equate the departure of our forces in July, August, or by early September with some kind of immediate deterioration in the situation.
So, of course, as we've just learned, that's exactly what happened. The country collapses from Friday to Monday. How did this happen? It's worth knowing. Andrew Bacevich is the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's the author of The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. Andy Bacevich joins us now. Thanks so much for coming on. You just heard Doug MacGregor accuse Pentagon leadership of lying to the country and to the men they lead about the state of Afghanistan. Do you think that's true?
Largely, yes. I think the key point is that the media is, in a sense, understandably obsessed with what's going on today in Kabul, this catastrophe that has unfolded. But I think that focus then distracts attention from the previous 20 years. And so the story of how we got here, which I think is the story that demands attention. Yes, the Biden administration certainly has failed in mismanaging this final withdrawal, but by God, there is plenty of blame to go around. Doug MacGregor focused on the responsibility of failed generalship appropriately. I think it's also we need to focus on the responsibility of successive administrations that have completely botched up this undertaking.
I agree with that completely, and I thank you for making that point. What do you think the lessons are? What do you think the people who made these decisions told themselves that turned out not to be true?
Well, I think we can bring Madeleine Albright into the conversation. People like Albright, people like the neoconservatives, Bill Kristol, whose name has been mentioned, people who believe that with the end of the Cold War, that we had become the masters of the universe, that the ultimate destination of human history was predetermined, that the United States was now in a position to nudge things along. If you look at the objectives in Afghanistan, defined at the Bonn Conference at the end of 2001, it's clear that American decision makers had lost all connection with reality, seemed to assume we were dealing with, Massachusetts rather than Afghanistan.
They can't even run Massachusetts. I was just there. I can confirm, as you know. So do you think, I wish we had more time, do you think what we're seeing on TV, because it is so evocative, such powerful images, do you think that this changes our foreign policy going forward? Is this the end of something?
Well, who's going to take responsibility? I think that's the question. Will the analysis of the failure of Afghanistan be willing to confront the fact that it was a bipartisan failure, not simply something to be hung around the necks of President Biden? Right.
You're seeing both sides attempt to leverage this for partisan gain, but I agree with you completely. It's all their faults. Andrew Bacevich, I appreciate your coming on tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So just hours ago, the top flack at the Pentagon, thoroughly discredited John Kirby, blamed the collapse of Kabul on the country's military. He said the United States has no way of predicting that the Taliban would overrun Afghanistan's national army. Watch.
It would certainly be wrong to conclude that the United States military did not view as a distinct possibility that the Taliban could overrun the country, and including Kabul. Now, as we've talked about here many times, it happened very fast. And one of the things that we couldn't anticipate and didn't anticipate was the degree to which Afghan forces capitulated, sometimes without a fight.
Jack Carr is a former Navy SEAL sniper, the author of the book The Devil's Hand. He joins us to assess what we're seeing in Afghanistan tonight. Jack, thanks so much for coming on. So you've heard a bunch of different military and State Department leaders and political leaders as well say that the Afghan army was actually pretty well trained. They're in pretty good shape. They were saying this up until 3 days ago. They could hold the Taliban at bay. Do you think people who were operating at your level in the country believe that was true?
Well, in 2003, I talked to a mujahideen who had fought the Soviets back in 2003, and he told me that quote we've been hearing all day today, that the Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time. And in the clips you just played and that have been playing all week of our senior level officials telling us that the government's not going to fall, there's no threat of evacuating the embassy, I can't help but think of Baghdad Bob back in 2003 as the American forces are moving in on Baghdad saying nothing to fear here, we have the Americans on the run. There's just too many similarities there. And you asked in your opening monologue why this happened. And it is because our enemy studies their history. They know their history. They know for centuries they've had to provoke, intimidate, protract, and then exhaust. So they knew that. Our senior level military leaders didn't look back even to the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan from 79 to 89, or they could have gone back to the early 20th century to look at the British Anglo-Afghan War, or the 18th century for two other English Anglo-Afghan wars. There was plenty. They didn't even have to go back to Genghis Khan. They didn't have to go back to any of that, Alexander the Great. There was plenty of case studies out there that would let us know that exactly what happened over the weekend was going to happen.
That's exactly right. I mean, it must. I've been thinking this all day. I mean, if you served there and you saw, people you knew killed there, and you gave part of your life to fighting that war, I mean, how does it feel to see this?
Well, it's certainly tough, and there are a lot of veterans out there hurting today, a lot of parents who lost children, brothers and sisters who lost siblings, there are spouses who lost their loved ones, children who lost their parents. So all of those feelings are hitting people really hard this weekend and will for the next few weeks. So to veterans out there, if you know somebody that's hurting, definitely step up, let them know you're thinking about them, and if you think someone's hurting, they probably are. And there's a lot of resources out there that you can reach out to, because regardless of how horrible things are in Afghanistan or even in this country right now, it's a pretty damn good day to be alive. And a couple other things there. We lost this because of our own imperial hubris. And U.S. political military establishment, they confused our entry and initial resolve with victory. And they were wrong. America's sons and daughters paid that price. And our leaders were really trapped by their own intellectual inertia. We talked about Alexander the Great. Graveyard of empires should have been a clue. And when we first went in there with those goals of disrupting al-Qaeda operations, destroying al-Qaeda organization, we reached what Clausewitz, right here in On War. And I brought this book because I heard there were some additions to the reading list this year, our military reading lists. And in case this got bumped off for something else, I just wanted to hold this up so our senior level officials could realize that this is pretty important. But what Clausewitz called the culminating point of victory. And we reached that fairly soon in 2001, 2002. And that means that if you go beyond that point, you turn that success into failure. And what we did was snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. We switched gears to reconstruction, nation building, shifted gears to focus on Iraq, and attempted to counter corruption, bribery, extortion, drug trafficking, and went way past that point, culminating point of victory.
Yeah. If you can't clearly define what your mission is, you probably ought to leave immediately, but they never did. Jack, I appreciate your coming on tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So it feels like this disaster spells the end of something. A change in our foreign policy, a real blow to the Biden administration? What is it exactly? Britt Hume joins us later in the hour to assess. But the capital of the United States, 11 people were shot with, quote, summarize the DA promoting threat. Questions.
The fact that
did not take Joe Biden's career. Conversation went on for an hour.
Tanks. So that should tell you something. That should tell those guys about the disconnect.
That conversation went on for an hour. You can watch the whole thing on Tucker Carlson today, right now on FoxNation.com. It is streaming. Britt Hume has followed Joe Biden's career for several hundred years now and knows a lot about foreign policy. He's standing by to assess what we are watching tonight in Afghanistan and what it means. That's next.
Go to PCmatic.com.
When he spoke today, the president did not take questions, so he didn't get to explain why just a few weeks ago he was telling us that the pullout from Afghanistan would look nothing like Saigon in 1975.
The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
Britt Hume is our senior political analyst. He's analyzed a lot of politics over many years. We're happy to have him here. Britt, thanks so much for coming on tonight. So, how do you assess the politics of this for the administration?
Well, I think this is a stain. It's unmistakable. The viewpoints across the board of this evacuation operation, of the pullout, the last piece of the pullout, have been uniformly the same, that it's a disaster, that it was horribly planned, it was misbegotten, the intelligence was bad, the judgment was bad, and the decision to do it like this was worst of all.
Yes.
And you're hearing that from all quarters now. And I think as people look at these images, the images will stay in people's minds. I mean, that pathetic scene on that tarmac today with people chasing that airplane, grabbing on someone falling off. I mean, people won't forget that. And it will be a stain on Joe Biden and his record that I think will endure. Now, it will fade to some extent as things will. The best thing he has going for him right now is possibly the fact that once the Taliban really secure control of the place, the amount of reporting we get out of there may be very limited. We may not know the extent of atrocities that are being committed in there, or the subjugation of women, and all the things that we try to prevent.
It's possible they will make their people wear masks, cover their faces.
Back to the burqas, yeah. Back to the burqas, that's possible.
So you got to think. So I have been frustrated for a long time that we're still there. That's my personal view. We should leave. 20 years is too long, et cetera, et cetera. And I still feel that way. So I'm glad we've left. But there's got to be some non-humiliating, non-chaotic, non-disastrous way to leave.
Exactly right. I mean, the real issue today, the thing that Biden rather cleverly talked about in political terms was he talked about the decision to withdraw. Well, that ship kind of sailed a long time ago.
Yeah,
we've been gradually withdrawing from there for years, and all that was in question was when the final pullout of the final remaining soldiers will be there. The mission of nation building, which everyone now seems to agree was a mistake, that has been abandoned for years. We've been drawing down our forces, but nothing we're doing there is nation building. How are you going to nation build with 2,500 troops, for God's sake? We were there as kind of military support for the Afghan forces, which seemed to be motivated by, not just supported by, but very much motivated by our presence there. And they, despite all the criticism that Biden leveled at them today, they fought long and hard and lost tens of thousands of soldiers killed fighting the Taliban. So there is that. But this question, this issue was all about how you execute the final pullout. And this was unmistakably, hideously botched.
Were you surprised by it, considering?
I was well, you hear these people say this, they say, we got a handle on this, we know, and all the rest of it, right? And, I wasn't as excited about the pullout as some others were. You and I may have a disagreement about that. But as for the execution of this piece of it, it's a disaster. And look, that's what he inherited. He inherited a drawn-down force about to be removed from Afghanistan. His job was to remove it safely and effectively. Right? And the consequences of his decision-making about how to do that are what we saw today and yesterday. This is on him. This piece of it is on him.
I wonder if it'll be recorded that way.
Well, I don't. At this point, somewhat to my surprise, we're seeing it reported that way now. I'm beginning to see cases of people saying, well, the American people really broadly support the withdrawal, and he's trying to change the subject to all we're talking about was the decision to withdraw and on. But this, I think, still leaves an indelible mark. Hard to forget these images.
Yeah, and I don't see any sign of competence. I mean, look at our cities. They're not good at it. Brit Hume, I appreciate your coming on.
You bet, Tucker.
Thank you. That's it for us tonight. A brand new episode of Tucker Carlson Today. As we mentioned with the one and only Mark Steyn,